Okay, let me take a moment to introduce our next guest. Dr. Samuel L. Perry is professor of sociology at the University of Oklahoma. A Texas native, Dr. Perry graduated top of his class from Dallas Theological Seminary in 2008 with a THM in New Testament Studies. He then went on to earn his PhD in sociology at the University of Chicago in 2015. Dr. Perry has won numerous awards for his scholarship and teaching in the areas of religion, race, and politics. In addition to over 100 peer-reviewed articles in academic journals, Dr. Perry is also the author or co-author of 5 books, including the award-winning Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States with Andrew Whitehead, and The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy with Philip Gorski. He recently finished his 5th book entitled Religion for Realists, Why we all need the scientific study of religion, now more than ever. He and his wife, Jill, have been married for 20 years and have 3 wonderful children, and it is our pleasure and privilege to have you with us, Dr. Perry.
Hey, what a privilege to be here. And I mean that it was a privilege to follow Pastor Ritchie's wonderful message. I just feel convicted. I feel pastored. I feel my heart has been ministered to, and I just am grateful for that message. At first, I felt like a lot of what I want to do today is I want to clear up definitions. I want to talk about the kinds of things, what Christian nationalism is and is not. And I felt like maybe, I should have gone first in the order so that the pastoral application of the things that I'm talking about, but I'm so glad he went first because I feel like that really helped frame just my own state of being right now and thoughts. In 2005, I was starting seminary at Dallas Theological Seminary. And because I was trying to save money, I was trying to test out of as many classes as I could at the time. And so one of those classes was world missions. And even though I tested out of this class, I was some of my friends, I was living in Swiss Towers, which is the married couple dorm on campus, and somebody said, hey, you've got to take this. It's a shame you tested out of that class because you've got to take this professor who teaches world missions. He's awesome. And I said, I don't have to take it anymore. I think I ought to. Then they said, trust me, you will not. It will not be a mistake. You've got to just take the class. And so I, not needing the class, I still sat in on these classes, and they were life-changing classes. I told my wife about them, and she, who was not a seminary student, she would come and sit with me in these classes. And we're going towards our degree, but they were transformative in the sense that I learned so much about contextualization of the gospel. I learned so much about cross-cultural ministry. I learned so much about what it meant to even minister in the city as somebody who is not going overseas, but somebody who just wants to minister to my neighbors. Those classes were taught by Dr. Mark Young, and so I was really pleased to get a chance to come back and chat with Dr. Young, and those courses meant a lot to me and to my wife, and we still talk about those today, so I appreciate you. And I appreciate all of you for the opportunity just to come and share and chat. Would you pray with me and for me during this time? God, I'm so grateful. What a privilege to be able to speak to such a strategic group of people. This group of professors and ministers and lay leaders in their churches, certainly those engaging online as well. I am overwhelmed with the weight of that. God, I pray that you would help me to apply the things that we heard in Pastor Ritchie's message, that I would speak with compassion, that I would speak with nuance, that I would try to stress the things that I am for rather than the things that I want to rail against or things I find problematic or the things I want to complain about. And I pray that you would give us insight into how to apply all of these things. I'll be, of course, speaking about social science and data, but I pray that you would help me to translate that in ways that maybe make sense in a practical way. And so, God, I lift this time up to you in Jesus' name. Amen. I want to speak to you with a different tone and from a different perspective than Pastor Ritchie did. I'm a social scientist by trade. which I love. One of the benefits of that, though, is, and you could say drawback, so just maybe a challenge, is that I am not a pastor, I am not a theologian, and I am not an ethicist. As a social scientist, I am concerned with data. I am concerned with what ought to be, certainly. But in my professional capacity as a social scientist, I am concerned with identifying accurately what is, so that we can have an informed conversation about what ought to be and how we ought to take action in light of those facts. If we don't get the facts straight on the ground, if we don't have an accurate understanding of what we're actually facing and what we're looking at, I think our ability to engage these kinds of things is really shortchanged. And so what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be presenting some data that we have been gathering. This is national level data. And so as a social scientist, I don't necessarily, I think Pastor Ritchie has had personal stories about his own interactions with Christian nationalism. I don't come from that place, honestly. I don't come with a lot of stories about how I've personally experienced this in my own life. My dad was a graduate of Dallas Theological Seminary. I think I have not been wounded by the church in any way. I've not been wounded by Christian nationalism personally in my own life. It is something that I see. In the aggregate, I see trends. I see the consequences of this thing nationally. And the way I'm doing my work is to try to help us understand in the aggregate the patterns that we see, why this is bigger than just this guy, right? I don't want to be at risk, because there is a risk here when we start talking about various ideologies or political theologies or things that we find problematic. There is the risk of what we call nut picking. Right? Nut picking is the thing where you take the most extreme and far-fetched and kind of wacky example of a group that you feel like you disagree with, and you say, look, all of them, look at your next pastor. It's the QAnon shaman guy. This is what you're staring down, America. That's not the case, right? Like most people, even the people that I feel like really have bought into this ideology, are not going to go storm the Capitol, and so I'm not trying to present them as if they are. I don't want to misrepresent this group at all. I really do want to accurately represent the kind of views that I feel like are still problematic and yet far more pervasive than the QAnon shaman guy, okay? This is an example of that. So this is tweets having to do with the word Christian nationalism in 2022, going from February all the way to November 2022, the November midterms, elections. And you see a huge jump there. Right? Sad to say that wasn't because of the publication of my own book in 2022. It was something else that happened in April. No, this was going on in June or July. I'll talk about what led to that huge bounce in the conversation about Christian nationalism. But it is no longer something where I have to convince people that, hey, this Christian nationalism thing is a thing you might want to pay attention to. It often trends on Twitter. As a matter of fact, every other day it seems to be trending. And in fact, it has become so common that I have had people reach out to me. This is fellow scholars who have done work on, say, evangelical Christians and politics, and their editors are now changing their subtitles in subsequent publications to reflect to insert Christian nationalism in those subtitles as a way to sell books. They're unapologetic about it. Look, you see these two books published in 2019, 2022, and 2020, 2021. They were first talking about white evangelicals or the people who elected Donald Trump, and their publishers made a decision to say, no, we're going to talk about Christian nationalism, even though neither of those books talk about that thing by name. I have a colleague, these are co-authors of mine. They recently published a book in 2022, The Everyday Crusade, Christian Nationalism in American Politics. Funny thing, they actually never mention Christian nationalism in this book. They call it something like American religious exceptionalism, or American political exceptionalism, or American national exceptionalism. But their publisher told them, and I'm almost quoting verbatim, if we're going to sell this book, we're going to call it Christian nationalism. So this is becoming something that is so common in discourse that it is something that it is like my dad, who worked for Procter & Gamble and sold Febreze spray, which is made by P&G. He said there was a time in P&G's history where we just slapped that name on everything, right? It just said like everything was tied with more Febreze, and every, Vicks Vapor Rub and NyQuil with more Febreze. Because if you put Febreze on it, it would sell that thing. Christian nationalism is becoming that kind of popular word, not just on the left, but also on the right, something to talk about. So I will bring this up a little bit more, but in 2022, right before the midterms, there was actually a town hall with some familiar faces you might recognize, Tony Perkins in the middle, Michelle Bachmann on the right. They wanted to have a town hall on the rise of the term Christian nationalism. Not the rise of Christian nationalism, but the rise of the term, which they presented in that public forum as a term that godless sociologists had invented to suppress conservative Christians from voting. Is that true? Is it something bigger than that? Is it something that precedes us and is in fact something that is far bigger than the things that we're doing? I like to think it is, and so I'm going to present some data on that. Some topics that we won't get to today. I want to start, we've been collecting data on this for the past 7 years. A lot of national surveys. I've had the good fortune to come into a lot of grant money for not me personally, but just to collaborate with a lot of people who have won grant money, and I'm able to put questions on these national surveys and able to collect a lot of data. So what I'm going to share with you today is really the ice shavings of the tip of the iceberg of the kind of information we have on this thing. The things that we're not going to get to today, but we can if you ask later, I'm happy to talk about, are things like eschatological visions. We have all kinds of data on how Christian nationalism is correspondent with certain views of the end times, how popular that is, how prevalent it is. Fertility regimes. Christian nationalism is strongly associated with the belief that we ought to have as many babies as possible to outbreed the libs, that kind of thing, that kind of strategy for cultural engagement and victory. And political polarization. I was talking with a group of pastors last night presenting data on how Christian nationalism is related to partisan hyperpolarization and the circumstances under which it exacerbates and amplifies our polarized discourse. So I'm not going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about what is white Christian nationalism. Notice I put that word white in there. I'm going to explain that. Okay, so Pastor Ritchie talked about Christian nationalism. I have for the past year or so put white in there. It's not to make it sound scary. It is because I believe it is fundamentally different than this kind of generic Christian nationalist idea, and I will explain why. So what is white Christian nationalism? Why do I call it that? What isn't white Christian nationalism? So I want to make sure that we're very clear on what I'm not talking about, and then why should we care, right? As seminary professors, as pastors, as practitioners, as people who are engaged in our churches, why does this matter? Both as Christians, both as Americans. So what is white Christian nationalism? We could think of white Christian nationalism as at least three things. And I'm not being evasive there. When I say that, when I define it three ways, I'm not just trying to kind of throw things and see what sticks and say it's all Christian nationalism. I really don't. I think we need to talk about Christian nationalism in different registers and in three different capacities of how it works. For example, I think white Christian nationalism could be defined as a political ideology. You could call it a political theology that shapes attitudes and behaviors. This is, I think, similar to what Pastor Ritchie was talking about, a political theology. We, as social scientists, we try to capture this using various questions on surveys. This is something I want to stress, and so if you hear anything, I want you to hear me that as a social scientist, I'm beholden to data. I'm beholden to evidence. And I really do mean that. This is something that I am bound to follow where the data lead as a social scientist. And so that requires that I be willing to change my conclusions when findings take me in a different direction. I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later if you want to, because I think since we started this journey of studying this thing we call Christian nationalism, we've taken us on various tours to try to figure out exactly what we're talking about and how this works. And I've had to nuance those conversations a little bit more on the basis of those findings and to gather questions in new ways and to try to assess this thing in different ways. And so I'm happy to talk about that more when we got an opportunity to do that. But I just want to stress that when we're talking about these things, we're trying to capture as best we can something that we feel like is out there, and we do that by asking questions and trying to make that as scientifically rigorous as possible. Right now, we have sought to develop new questions just to really try to be razor sharp in exactly what we're talking about. So we ask Americans a series of questions. We want to ask them how much they agree with various questions that we feel like get at this idea of Christian nationalism. For example, we ask them how much do they agree with the following statements. America has a special place in God's plan, that there's some way in which we're set apart, we're special. That I consider the founding documents like the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution to be divinely inspired, right? It's that there is some kind of sacred, special relationship that we have. Look at the other ones, though. These are more about like what Phil Gorski and I call the deep story of Christian nationalism, that there is some kind of a mythological connection that we as a country have with Christianity, and so this is trying to get at that idea. The federal government should declare the U.S. a Christian nation. That's pretty explicit, right? Like the federal government actually ought to take a step to say this is a Christian nation unapologetically. The Bible should be the foundation of our legal system. Christians have a responsibility to gain control over national institutions like the government, education, and the media. And I consider being a Christian an important aspect of being truly American. There's an identity component that you feel like real Americans, or at least my kind of Americans, are Christian Americans. And those two things should be, the Venn diagram should be more of a circle than something that is two separate spheres. So what we do is we take all these responses to these questions and we add them up and we try to create a scale. Right, so and the scale, if you score lower on this scale, we say that this is somebody who largely rejects this ideology of Christian nationalism. And if you score really high on all that, means like you agree or strongly agree with all of those questions, we'd say that you're probably the kind of person that subscribes to Christian nationalist ideology. You've probably bought this. Now, this is like a 24 to 28 like value scale. Like there's all kinds of scores on this. We're very careful to talk about Christian nationalism not as a clinical category. It's not a binary. Like I don't like calling people Christian nationalists. Up until recently, that wasn't something that people commonly did. It is something that is becoming more common. People are actually calling themselves that. But traditionally, people were kind of like, no, I'm not a Christian nationalist, or what, and that's fine. I don't want to call people that. It's kind of a conversation stopper. Right? It's like calling somebody a racist or a Nazi. Like I don't want to go around calling people Christian nationalists. I'd rather talk about this ideology, the spectrum of Christian nationalism that you can kind of reject, that you can kind of be ambivalent about, that you can warm up to, and that you can be a true believer in. This is something that exists that way. So why do we call it white Christian nationalism? This is something I want to nail because it has been, I think we've gotten the charge that when we started calling it white Christian nationalism, like, did you just do that to make it sound racist? Or did you do that to make it sound scary because you have some kind of a problem with this and you feel like calling it white makes it this really racist thing? No, actually, empirically, we have all kinds of reasons to call it white Christian nationalism, and I'll give you a few right here. So we find that white Americans, when they hear our questions about Christian nationalism, they respond in drastically different ways to other kinds of questions than people of color do, especially African Americans, but also Latinos as well. This is an example of that. This is the percentage we have controlled. So statistically, we have done all of these, what we call regressions or multivariate models, where we've tried to statistically control for all of these other factors like age, education, region of the country, all those. We're trying to isolate the influence of one variable, Christian nationalism, on this outcome, people's responses on these questions. So what I'm showing you is after controlling for all of those other things, we asked Americans whether they believe the 2020 presidential election was stolen from Donald Trump. Right? So Christian nationalism is across that bottom, 0 to 28. This is just a scale that we're using. Notice that as African Americans increase in Christian nationalism, they're no more likely. They don't change at all, hardly. Like there's no significant trend. They don't become more likely to buy this idea that the election was stolen. Look for white Americans. That's what we call a linear association, right? The more you subscribe to Christian nationalism, even after holding constant all of these other factors, level of education, region of the country, political party, ideological identity, all of those kinds of things, Christian nationalism seems to incline Americans, white Americans in particular, to buy this idea that the 2020 election was stolen from Trump in ways that it does not work for people of color, and specifically African Americans. It works differently. Thus, white Christian nationalism. But let me give you some other examples, because that's not the only one. I have lots and lots of slides on this. So here's another example. We asked Americans who receives the most discrimination in this country right now. And this is the percentage of people, after controlling for all these other factors, who said white Americans experience the most discrimination. Now, notice in our question, like we never ask about race in our questions. In our Christian nationalism questions, we only ask about like Christian values, Christian heritage, Christian nation, all those things. It's all religious language. And yet, as white Americans subscribe to Christian nationalism more, we have a linear association with then being more likely to say, you know what, white people are the most discriminated against. Whereas African Americans don't seem to budge much, right? Like they don't seem to be more inclined to think, you know what, white people face the most discrimination. There's some kind of a weird connection among white Americans with this idea of Christian nation, the nation belongs to Christians, people like us, and an idea that white people are under attack or persecuted. We've actually demonstrated this experimentally as well, and again, we can talk about those things. Here's another one, though. This is the percentage of white and black Americans who agree that true American patriots may have to resort to physical violence in order to save our country. Getting a little bit more worrying here. Notice that as Christian nationalism increases for African Americans, we don't see a lot of movement on that. But look what happens for white Americans. Again, close to a linear association. The more you subscribe to Christian nationalism as a white American, the more likely you are to say, things are getting so bad, we may have to resort to physical violence, right? So all of that to say, and again, I have lots of examples of this that we talk about in our book and we've talked about in various publications. Christian nationalism seems to behave completely differently for white Americans than it does for people of color, which is why we call it white Christian nationalism, because the kind of thing that we're talking about, the thing that we believe is associated with all kinds of antisocial and anti-democratic and authoritarian values and ideas, is usually found among white people when white people subscribe to this ideology, not people of color. What do people of color think? Well, African Americans, oftentimes we find that they seem to, when they answer our questions about Christian nation, Christian values, Christian heritage, they seem to have something more aspirational in mind, right? Like Martin Luther King Jr. occasionally would reference like Christian nation or those kinds of things, but he didn't have in mind this time, this earlier bygone time when the right values held sway and the right people were in charge. He wasn't thinking nostalgically for this earlier kind of like godly time. He was actually thinking for the values that America never quite lived up to, right? Like that, the nation that we were always supposed to be. We find that reflects more accurately what African Americans are thinking when they answer these questions on Christian nationalism. But white Americans seem to have something different in mind, have something more like nostalgia, something being taken away, something being ripped from the rightful heirs of this kind of cultural and political heritage. So Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism could be thought of as a political ideology that shapes attitudes and behaviors. Increasingly, however, it's something else. It could also be seen as an emerging identity that potentially even more powerfully shapes attitudes and behaviors. This is something that people are starting to own. What happens when people start to own an identity? When people start to embrace it, it becomes an even more powerful motivator of our political actions and behavior. This is one of the almost axiomatic principles of political science, especially within the last 2 decades we've observed. People don't vote primarily because of their political views or because of their coherent beliefs about policy. People often vote because of fear and anger, and usually that relates to how their identities have been activated, right? How people have spoken to their identities, how their identities are under threat. And when people are embracing this idea that we are Christian nationalists, we ought to own that proudly, it becomes something that is potentially even more motivating. Remember that graph I showed you about that spike in Twitter mentions of Christian nationalism? Not having to do with anything we did. That was actually Marjorie Taylor Greene. So Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is a House rep in Georgia, she went on Twitter and recorded a video of herself saying the Republican Party ought to be the party of Christian nationalism. She actually went on several speaking engagements and said that multiple times. And if there was any doubt what Marjorie Taylor Greene meant by that, she shows you with the dukes up, right? Like it is combat, it is fighting the left. She sold shirts with that, fundraised on that idea, and used this idea that we ought to be the party of Christian nationalists. Within the last year, actually last October, 2 books back-to-back came out. The Case for Christian Nationalism by Stephen Wolfe and Christian Nationalism, a biblical guide to taking dominion and discipling the nations by Andrew Torba. Now, if we want to talk about those authors and the contents of those books later, that's fine. But I just want to stress like this is becoming a coherent enough identity for people to actually publish books arguing for that by name, and for people to buy those books and to say that this is something that we really ought to subscribe to, and movements happening saying we really ought to embrace this idea. Last year around this time, October of 2022, we actually asked Americans whether or not the term Christian nationalists described them. Yeah, and this is the results we got. About 25% of all Americans said the term Christian nationalists described them either very or somewhat well. It was about 45% of Republicans, and it was about 58% of white evangelicals. Now, do I think they knew what Christian nationalism meant? No. We didn't define it for them. Like, I don't think they knew that at all. But it is something when you see that on a survey and you say, yeah, that sounds like something I'd be down with, right? Right? If you don't even know what that word means, but you hear like, that sounds like something I'd be for. And that is something that is about half of Republicans and the large majority of evangelicals. And Pew, thankfully, is like collecting data on these things now, and I'm interested to see what they find as well. So this is an emerging, not only an ideology, but it is also an emerging identity that is perhaps even more salient and powerful. Lastly, white Christian nationalism can be thought of as a political strategy aiming to activate that ideology and identity and to institutionalize Christian supremacy. And you can put the parentheses, white Christian supremacy, in that. I don't believe, say, the authors that have written these books about why Christian nationalism should be the dominant kind of frame moving forward for the church. I don't believe when they talk about Christian nationalism, I don't think they have in mind the historic black Protestant church, the principles of the, say, like black social justice, liberation. I don't think they have in mind Latino Protestants. I think Stephen Wolfe would actually be pretty explicit that he means Anglo-Protestantism, and what you mean is white Christian nationalism. And I don't mean to say racist. Let's talk about ethnicity. He means white ethnic culture, right? Like that should be the white ethnic Protestant culture should be the dominant culture and should set the stage for biblical principles, interpretation, and subsequent policies and those kinds of things. How does this political strategy work? Well, it works by scaring and angering people who are activated by this kind of rhetoric. Donald Trump is a good example of this. I've just given you several examples of rhetoric that he's had over the past few years, but Donald Trump is a factory, basically an assembly line of these kinds of quotes, not hard to find. We are under siege. What's he saying? Well, he's trying to provoke this idea that like we need to rally around and to get our influence, to get our culture back. We are under siege. We're losing ground. Christians are losing ground in this country. We're going to protect Christianity. And then positioning himself as the person who's going to be your savior, as Pastor Ritchie talked about. I'm going to defend you. I'm on your side. Christianity is under siege. There's an assault. There's an assault on Christianity and everything we stand for. We're going to stop the assault. We're stopping cold the attacks on Judeo-Christian values. And since their loss in 2016, the extreme left has not given up their relentless crusade against Christians and Americans of all faiths. This is not only happening with Donald Trump, but as you've probably seen in your own representatives, this is something that is also represented in that kind of rhetoric. The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. That's not how the founding fathers intended it. And I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk that's not in the Constitution. It was in a stinking letter that means nothing like they say it does. This was a quote from Lauren Boebert in a church on Sunday, right before an election on Tuesday, which she won, right? And all that to say, I'm not even debating like what her interpretation of the Constitution or the founding fathers. It wasn't a stinking letter. It's not in the separation of church and state. What is not in the Constitution, like she means that phrase, right? So like I'm not even trying to debate that, but I am trying to point out that this kind of rhetoric is used to appeal to an audience that feels under siege. Something that Pastor Ritchie said at the end of his presentation that I wanted to like say an audible amen to and add an addendum at the end at the back of the room where I was sitting. We actually have experimental data. So some colleagues of mine, I work with a lot of like, I'm a sociologist, but I work with political scientists and social psychologists. We run these experimental studies. And a team of social psychologists that I've been working with, they actually ran a study recently, and this was fascinating what they found. So what they did is they wanted to see what happens to a group of Christians when you tell them that their numbers are declining, that they're going to be the minority by 2050 or something. Something like Dr. Bird was talking about a little bit, like dealing with this idea that like, hey, Christians are not growing, they're declining. This is something that Pew is showing, and this is something that we're facing. What happens when you tell them, and does it change their political views? And it actually did. They actually found what happened when you told a group of Christians that, hey, by 2050, Christians are going to be the minority. They responded with two things. They were more likely to subscribe to Christian nationalist ideology, and they increased in their Trump support. Right? Those were the two outcomes, right? Like they increased in Christian nationalism and they increased in Trump support. What's going on there? Well, Pastor Ritchie was exactly right that this is a response. It's a response to threat. It's a response to pain. It's a response to the real, the perceived but actually real loss of cultural and political influence. Like I'm not the sociologist who's like, hey, suck it up, Christians still rule everything. Like I understand, like that there is a real feeling of loss in cultural and political influence that has to be processed in a healthy way and engaged in a way that we as Christians feel like we are simultaneously living out our witness, but at the same time contending for things that we feel like are worth contending for. So it's not a, hey, let's just roll over kind of idea, but it is this idea that Christian nationalism, I believe, is a circling the wagons kind of response to the very real loss of cultural and political power. What isn't white Christian nationalism? I want to be clear on that because I think we have, there's a real danger here I want to acknowledge as people on the left have picked up this word too, and probably arguably before people on the right picked it up. They kind of ran with this. There's the real danger of Christian nationalism being slapped on everything that just people on the left don't tend to like. It's in danger of becoming the left's version of the word woke, right? So like woke is also a word you use to sell books now, right? Like it is also a word that you use to kind of generate a lot of hostility or anger or fear, to call things that you don't like woke. Christian nationalism is becoming the left's version of that, right? Like it's becoming so flexible that like every Christian involved in politics or everything that I don't like that sounds more conservative than me is Christian nationalism, and I don't mean that at all. And so what isn't white Christian nationalism? The first thing we demonstrated in our studies was white Christian nationalism does not mean white evangelical. This was something that actually motivated our initial studies when we were around 2015, 2016, especially after Trump's election. There was all this talk about like how 80% of white evangelicals put Trump in office and what's wrong with white evangelicals. And we were gathering this data and we said, like, really, it's not about being a white evangelical. There's this underlying ideology that Trump was able to appeal to, this idea of cultural and political loss and threat, that Christians felt like, yes, you are the person who is going to bring that back for us. We're going to be saying Merry Christmas again. We're going to be having influence. Trump promised verbally, like I'm quoting him verbatim, Christians will have power. This is what he said. With me in office, you don't have to worry about anything. You will have plenty of power. Trust me, right? Believe me. Right, there's this idea. Tony Perkins was asked, I showed a picture of Tony Perkins. He was asked by Politico, why do you guys keep giving Trump mulligans? This was about the Stormy Daniels thing. Why'd you give Trump a mulligan on the Stormy Daniels deal? And Tony Perkins, again, I've said this so many times, I could quote him verbatim. He said, we were tired of being pushed around by Obama and all of his leftists, and we were glad somebody was on the playground who was willing to punch the bully. And that is an encapsulation of that kind of view of, right? It's not about being a white evangelical, whatever that means. It's about a complex of beliefs that says something that is rightfully ours has been taken from us and we want it back, and the ends justify the means. And if you got to break a few eggs democratically to make that happen, then so be it, right? So what we found, this is an example. So white evangelicals, white liberal Protestants, and white Catholics. This is the percentage of American voters who voted for Trump in 2020 by Christian tradition. Notice that, yes, white evangelicals were more likely to pull for Trump. White Catholics, less behind them, and then mainline Protestants or liberal Protestants. But here's what I'm sorry, this got cut off, but let me show you. What I have here is our Christian nationalism scale, just divided into quartiles. I've just made it into like 25% like increments. Notice what happens for each of those groups as you move up the Christian nationalism scale. They all move together, right? Like, in other words, there's really no difference in denomination across like white Catholics or liberal Protestants or white evangelicals. What really matters is your adherence to Christian nationalist ideology in this case, right? Notice, white Catholics and white liberal Protestants, white evangelicals are basically identical to one another at the higher ends of Christian nationalism. All of them voted for Trump, like almost all of them. But the people who largely reject Christian nationalism, none of them. So I'll put it this way, a white Catholic who subscribes to Christian nationalist ideology has more in common with a white evangelical and a white liberal Protestant than a white Catholic who is kind of resisting that ideology, right? Like it's about that. It's not about being a white evangelical. Also, white Christian nationalism is not Christian patriotism. I was so thankful that Pastor Ritchie said this, and I wanted to wholeheartedly agree. I don't think it's just like playing with definitions to say that nationalism, as I understand it, is different from patriotism. I think there's a long history of writers and scholars and historians that would draw a clear distinction between what it means to be a patriot and what it means to be a nationalist. If you're interested in a great book that I think is arguing for patriotism, there's a couple of good books. One is by a historian named Jill Lepore called This America, The Case for the Nation. And she argues for a form of like what she calls civic nationalism, but she draws a distinction between that and ethnic nationalism or ethno-nationalism. She's arguing for a form of patriotism that is good and healthy. Another by a scholar who's a political scientist, political theorist at Yale. His name is Peter Smith. And he wrote a book called Patriotism in the Age of Oh, it's the word I'm sorry, I'm forgetting it, but he's arguing for what he calls enlightened patriotism. That is different from nationalism. I think that's a good thing. I think it's good to be a good neighbor. I think it's a very Christian thing to say, like, this is my home. These are the people that I love, and I'm going to serve and sacrifice to make it a better place, rather than to say it's only for people like us and to try draw boundaries around, say, ethnic culture, which I think is something else, right? I think these scholars and historians have something in mind, a creedal nationalism or patriotism that unites us, adherence to, I hope, Christian values, but also, say, founding principles in the Declaration of Independence, right? Like that we full legal equality, government by the people, limited government in significant ways, religious freedom. It is not white Christian nationalism to recognize positive Christian influence in the United States. Right? That's just accurate history, right? Like it's okay to say that. Like, and to the extent that people are uncomfortable acknowledging that, I think that is gone too far, right? Like that is a counter ideology that is in the air or on the other end of the spectrum, to where, like, it's one thing to say that every good thing in our country came from Christians. It's another good thing to say nothing good in our country came from Christians or Christian ideas. Those are both equally inaccurate statements, right? Like those are bad things. So that is nothing I want to be associated with or guilty of saying. Lastly, white Christian nationalism is not Christians getting involved in politics, right? So we get this one a lot, right? Like that are you saying just because I'm interested in politics that's Christian nationalism, where you're making political statements, you must be a Christian nationalist? Or Martin Luther King Jr., black Christians, like talking about civil rights, and they must be Christian nationalists. And according to how we understand what this means, I don't think that counts as the same thing. I think white Christian nationalism is associated with saying that the country rightfully has always and shall always be for people like us, and usually that's circumscribed in a very, like, Anglo-Protestant way. It's about our culture, it's about our values, about people like us, and it is with the understanding that there will be an institutionalized hierarchy between those groups. The books that I was referencing a second ago, Stephen Wolfe and Andrew Torba, are actually pretty explicit with the idea that non-Christians won't be able to hold office. They will have Sabbath laws or blasphemy laws that will be able to lock people up for kind of sinning in the ways that we feel like are violations of our own moral values. That becomes really problematic in a multiracial and multicultural and multi-religious society that values religious freedom. It's difficult to sustain that. So I don't think that means Christians aren't allowed to get involved in politics. I think that's a good thing. I think that's a part of patriotism and being a good neighbor and good citizen. So why should we care, right? This is another caveat that I want to get. When we talk about Christian nationalism, are you really just talking about being a conservative Christian, like in politics, or like buying into conservative values? The things I want to show you, if this is what it means to be a politically conservative Christian, I'm not sure this is a good advertisement for being a politically conservative Christian, rather the kinds of things that I want to portray. As Christian nationalism increases among white Americans in particular, we see tendencies towards approving of authoritarian violence. To give an example, here's several examples. This is across the Christian nationalism scale at the bottom. Here's adherence to various views. The best way to stop a bad guy with a gun is to have good guys with guns at the very top. Biggest problem with the death penalty is we don't use it often enough. Authorities should be able to use any means necessary in order to keep law and order. And if national security is at risk, I support the use of torture. Now, you might say, like, hey, I kind of buy some of those or most of those or whatever, but I think altogether what this points to is it points to a linear tendency for people who subscribe to Christian nationalist ideology to be not only familiar with, but kind of favoring a means of authoritarian violence of controlling problem populations. We show this in our book, The Flag and the Cross, that it is also associated with just generalized violence, not just violence about, like, controlling populations, but just, being strong, being, not always having to talk things out, not always, nonviolence, not always being the best road. This will be clear as in the later slides as well. It also seems to be strongly associated with conspiratorial views. Here's Christian nationalism. This is, again, among white Americans, not among people of color. This doesn't work this way for people of color. As Christian nationalism increases, they're more likely to say that Antifa and Black Lives Matter were mixed into the crowd and started the January 6th riots. Now, I want you to look at the very high end of that Christian nationalism scale. we're approaching about 90% in that top quartile. We're approaching about 90% of Americans, white Americans who subscribe to Christian nationalist ideology, saying that, you know who's to blame for Antifa? It's plants. Or who's to blame for January 6th? It's Antifa and Black Lives Matter. And it's certainly not patriots and certainly not Christians. Belief in the QAnon core conspiracy. What is that? Well, sometimes you put these questions on surveys and you feel kind of ridiculous, like certainly nobody's going to answer this. I'm going to be the first survey ever where 0 people said they agree with this statement or yes. The QAnon conspiracy that the government and the economic institutions and the political institutions, they are run by a cabal of child sex traffickers who run this kind of secretive ring. That's the QAnon conspiracy we asked about. And we find that the more white Americans subscribe to Christian nationalist ideology, the more likely they are to say, yeah, that sounds like something they would do. That sounds like something I'd agree to. There are other examples as well. So this is, look at the ones that are going up over here. As Christian nationalism increases, white Americans are more likely to say the COVID vaccines themselves have killed hundreds of people. By the way, we asked this just around August of 2021. That was the last time we asked this. So like that certainly, that wasn't even hardly a minor kind of like idea at the time, and yet it was something that Christian nationalists were very much so subscribing to. The government is hiding what it knows about the origins of COVID-19, which is the one that's going down. The COVID vaccines are both safe and effective at preventing COVID-19. So as you subscribe to Christian nationalist ideology in a linear fashion, you're more likely to say, no, the COVID-19 vaccines are not helpful at preventing or helping at all. What about anti-democratic? Here's a couple of examples. Before the 2020 election, so before there was any talk, we fielded this survey. Before there was any talk of a stolen election, before there was any any claim that like Biden had, across all these states planted ballots and things coming out of people's trunks and those kinds of things, we asked Americans their views on just voter access, right? Like about just elections in general. We found that the more Americans subscribe to Christian nationalism, white Americans in particular, we found that the more likely they were to say, we already make it too easy to vote in this country, that they would support hypothetical civics tests in order to vote. Like that's a Jim Crow thing, right? Like that's one we just kind of threw in there again, like surely nobody will say this. And again, linear trend with the more you subscribe to this ideology, the more likely you are to say, you know what, people should have to pass civics tests. They would revoke the voting rights of certain felons for life. It's called lifelong felon disenfranchisement, and almost no state practices that these days. Look at the one that goes down. We found that the more Americans, white Americans in particular, subscribe to Christian nationalism, the more likely they are to say that voting is a privilege. Or sorry, I've got that backwards. We asked Americans simply, is voting a right or a privilege? Now, the vast majority of Americans, vast majority say that voting is a right? So it's something that shall not be infringed in that kind of way, that as a citizen you get the right to vote. The more you subscribe to Christian nationalism, the more likely you are to disagree that it's a right. The more likely you are to think it is a privilege. In other words, not something that shall not be infringed, but something that we can take away, that we can limit. And again, these are linear relationships. It tells a story, all these together, that the more you subscribe to Christian nationalist ideology, not only are you warmer to the idea of authoritarian violence to control problem populations, but you're also warmer to the idea that, only certain people should be able to have access to the levers of power, right? We make it too easy. We need to reduce voter access in some ways. We need to raise the bar. It's a privilege. It's not a right. It's something that we should constrain and curtail. Here's the last one. These are two statements that we asked Americans whether they agreed with. There's a storm coming soon that will sweep away elites in power and restore rightful leaders. And because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to physical violence in order to save our country. Again, clear linear relationship between white Americans subscribing to Christian nationalist ideology and again, controlling for all the other factors. We're controlling for partisanship. We're controlling for the region of the country you live in, your education, your income, all those kinds of things. What all this, I think, tells us together is a problematic story, that Christian nationalist ideology, whether you hold that ideology, let's bring this back down to where you and I are. You might say, hey, I'm kind of warm to this idea that the government has been Christian, should be Christian, that's a good thing. I'm not saying that you necessarily agree with all the things that I've put up here, but I am saying in national data that we've run multiple times, statistically speaking, the more you subscribe to that idea, the more likely you are to be in with the crowd that very much so subscribes to these ideas, right? Like that these things, there seems to be a relationship, and I believe a causal relationship, between holding to this kind of view, this kind of vision or fusion of American civic life with Christianity, about who America rightfully belongs to and shall always belong to, and holding these kinds of views, because it's about, like Pastor Ritchie was talking about, it's about threat, it's about anxiety, it's about power, it's about getting something back and keeping something that you feel like is being taken from you. So what comes next? Here is actually if this is something that concerns you, here's where I've got some good news for you, all right? Maybe good news and bad news. Maybe I should qualify even that, the good news. So there's some good news, and yet it's qualified good news. So let me be clear how I mean that. I don't think there's any evidence that Christian nationalist ideology is increasing in the general population. Despite what you may have heard, there is not a swell of this. There may be a swell of people who are like identifying that with Christian nationalist as a label. That's probably true, just as books have come out and people are kind of owning it as it's like a basket of deplorables move. Like you kind of own the thing that you feel like is being thrown at you, and you use it to mobilize. I think I've actually heard people say that. But as far as Christian nationalist views, across various surveys, there's really no evidence that is increasing. I'll give you a couple of data points. This is from multiple surveys. Let's start in 2016 with the Baylor Religion Survey. Since 2017, and this is a 2022 survey that we asked, the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. It's declined pretty linearly since that time, in only about like a 5-year span. Here's a different look at that. The percentage of Americans across, say, 20 years who say being a Christian is very important for being truly Americans. Really high in 2004 after 9/11. There was this kind of like circle the flag response where we all became like really nationalist in that sense. 2014, 2016, and 2020, again, it is declining. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is because I think among the American population, most Americans who have heard of, Pew did a study on this recently, it was in the fall of last year. They studied showing that among the most Americans who have actually heard of this thing called Christian nationalism, most of them have a negative evaluation of it. It's not, most people are not subscribing to this thing as a positive. So if you have heard of this thing, most likely you've heard of something as kind of scary and problematic and probably associated with racism. The more Americans hear that and receive that, the more people who would have like 10 years ago just kind of mindlessly agreed to it on a survey, the more they kind of think twice and say, hey, this isn't something I want to be a part of. No, I recognize what that question's asking about. No, I'm not that person. That's not me, right? So you have a reduction in that. Another part of this is just the story of gradual secularization, like as our American society is becoming less churched, less affiliated, then they're going to become less Christian nationalist in that way. But remember I said this is qualified news, right? This is qualified good news. What happens when a group of people really do start to become a threatened minority? What happens when they recognize that? What happens when they start to mobilize around that fact? There's the potential to become more militant, more organized, more radicalized, the more desperate, you could say. It's actually really not hard to predict. I like to joke with my students that political science isn't rocket science, right? Like it's in other words, like it's human beings are difficult to read sometimes and to predict what they're going to do, and sometimes they're just kind of easy to predict what they're going to do given a certain set of situations and circumstances. So what do you do? What would you do when your numbers and popularity are declining, but you still have to win electoral majorities, right? You still have this pesky thing called democracy where you have to win electoral majorities. There's a great political scientist at Harvard. His name is Daniel Ziblatt, and he's come out with several books recently, one called The Tyranny of the Minority, which I would recommend. That one just came out. A great book is called How Democracies Die by Levitsky and Ziblatt. It's a bestseller. But before that, Daniel Ziblatt wrote this really important book about like conservatism in the UK and European conservatism. I wish he hadn't used the word conservatism because it's a little bit too broad, right? Like but he makes an argument for what he calls the conservative dilemma. This is something that has become like a very axiomatic principle in political science. And again, I have a problem saying it's the conservative dilemma because I don't want to attack or problematize just being a conservative for its own sake. But what he's describing is he's describing a group of people, this dilemma, this challenge that you face when you believe power is being taken from you. It was historically yours, and now it is no longer yours, and it's more difficult to maintain because of demographic transitions, and that's something that you feel threatened by. So you face a dilemma in a democracy where you have to win electoral majorities. How do you maintain power for your group that you are losing when you still have to win electoral majorities? Well, it's not hard to predict from there, right? Like, you only have a few options. So what do you do? Well, you could stand on principle and die off, right? You can just get beat in election after election after election and just lose forever and stand on that principle. Or you could change and appeal to a broader electorate, right? Like, you have to adjust. And this is how democracy is supposed to work, right? So parties in democracy are supposed to say, you know what, we got our butts handed to us in that last election. We are obviously not selling something that is resonating with this audience, and so we have to adjust slightly to appeal to a broader electorate. Like, our population is changing. They're obviously not the same people that we thought, we were appealing to 20 years ago. So how do we appeal to this broader electorate? Different issues, different platform, and those kinds of things. So you can change, and you can appeal, and you can try to win that way. Or what you can do is you can do what two political scientists, one at Yale, one at Berkeley, call in their book, Let Them Eat Tweets, which is a fabulous book. It's such a great book. I'm so jealous by that title. It's called Let Them Eat Tweets by Hacker and Pearson. And what they argue is they argue for the emergence of a new political strategy that they call plutocratic populism. That is where those who are historically in power have to be able to get people to consistently vote against their own economic and interests. That usually means working class white people. So what do? If you're like in power, you want to make sure you get those great those tax write-offs. You want to keep your wealth. You don't want to share any of that. But you have to get working class white people to vote against their own health care and all those kinds of things. What you do is you distract them, right? Like, you say, like, look at those Muslims. You look at those immigrants, right? Like, look at those people cutting in line in front of you, getting what you don't deserve. All of those things. This is something that we've observed in various contexts, right? Like the anger, right? That comes from this idea that, like, people are getting stuff they don't deserve, and they're cutting things in line, and they're taking what's ours. And rather than looking up and saying, like, who's really taking what's ours is the people who are exploiting us, or the people who are not willing to share, or not pass policies that will actually benefit all of us, and those kinds of things. And so you can distract with elements of fear and anger, and blame the woke, the immigrants, the Muslims, and the LGBTQ persons who you feel like are really throwing our country off a cliff, right? And all at the same time, getting those people to say, like, yes, come and save us from all of these kinds of outside forces that are doing it. Lastly, another thing you can do is you can make it so that you can maintain control without electoral majorities, right? You can engage in voter suppression and rigging. You can control courts with lifetime appointments. Does any of this sound familiar? Right? Does it sound like, if it does, it's because there are really only a few options, right? Like, it's not hard to predict how this goes in the future. So I think where this leads us is as people in the church. I'm a lay leader in my own church. My wife and I lead a community group at a loosely affiliated SBC church affiliated with the Acts 29 network in Norman, Oklahoma. And I lead a men's Bible study on Tuesday morning. We're going through Keller's Every Good Endeavor, which is a great book talking about work and us working outside of the church and in various, like, professorships and law practices and what that looks like to have influence where we are. Where this, I think, leads us is to have an awareness of how we continue to build relationships with people who are very scared and angry and distracted, right? So we talked about this last night as a group of pastors. One of the things that is killing us in terms of political polarization in the United States is the idea that we are increasingly self-sorting into groups of people who are exactly like us in every indicator. Like, the people on the left are sorting, and they are only affiliating with other people who are just like them, and the people on the right who have learned that what it means to be a committed Christian is to be politically conservative Republican, to homeschool, to eat at Chick-fil-A every day, to, like, work out at the Family Y, to do all these kinds of things, to have a separate soccer league that you play with, to read different, all those kinds of things, and to hate those other people, right? That's killing us. Like, what actually helps? And this is statistically speaking, and I'm saying this as a social scientist, what actually helps is what we call cross pressures, cross-cutting pressures, right? Is having relationships, lots of relationships with people who are not like me in all of these really salient categories. It means maybe holding some moderate political views in these ways. It means holding some really strong political views in these ways, but it means being in context where I'm going to interact with people who are not like me politically, and I don't get a chance to hate them, and I don't get a chance to dislike them because I know them and I love them and I care for them and they care for me, right? This is something I think a challenge that we face as pastors, as seminary leaders, as people who are just trying to have an active and positive role in our community is how do we ourselves lead in talking to people who are different, and how do we get our people to engage in that as well? I hope to be able to draw on your wisdom later as we talk about these things and the pastors in this room and to feed off of that, because I don't have a lot of answers to that as a social scientist. I wish I did. I wish I had this great game plan. Just going to the next slide, but all I got is this, right? All I got is that, right? Like I don't have this great game plan for how we get over that, but I am dying to hear what kind of wisdom you can share about how to make that happen. So thank you so much for your time.